Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Caitlin Donnelly. I am the program director for Nonprofit Vote, and this is Making Voter Registration Drives More Culturally Competent. I'm excited for some great speakers today, but before we dive into our agenda, there's a couple announcements I do want to make. If you have not seen the Nonprofit Power Report, what are you waiting for? Get over to nonprofitvote.org/nonprofitpower to learn about how nonprofits are actually closing voter participation gaps and the great work happening in so many states across the country and the nonprofit organizations behind that work. So we have an overview of the field program that got us these numbers. But then what's really exciting are our findings showing the turnout advantages faced by different groups and the reach of nonprofits, showing that our organizations reach people who are less likely to be represented at the polls, lower income voters, younger voters, and voters of color. And we shrink those turnout gaps for a lot of those groups. So you can read all the data online. As well as case studies, a practitioner's report, and we have social assets. So if you want to share those findings on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, we've made it really easy to do that. It's also September, so of course I have to do a plug for National Voter Registration Day. If you're on this webinar today, you're interested in doing voter registration, so I hope you are already signed up. But if you haven't signed up yet, please do. And please sign up, even if you are a regular celebrator of National Voter Registration Day, but haven't actually signed up with us in the past. It's really helpful because in addition to being able to send you resources, posters, stickers, and surveys so that we can hear about how your event went, it also helps us really demonstrate the importance and participation in this day, which helps drive more resources to nonpartisan voter engagement. So check out nationalvoterregistrationday.org, and you can sign up as a partner there. You have a little bit of time left where you can still get those free posters and stickers in the mail. And we are just about 4 weeks ahead of National Voter Registration Day, which will be September 28th. So mark your calendars if you haven't already. So we'll get into our agenda today. We want to start with addressing, what does cultural competency even mean? Nonprofit Vote has not done a webinar specifically on this topic, so we want to make sure that we're all on the same page about, what we're speaking about. And then we have 2 great speakers who are going to share how their organizations have made voter registration drives really culturally competent and culturally relevant for their communities. So we have Nadia Alamah from APIA Vote Michigan and Ramdat Singh from Caribbean Equality Project. So they're both on hand going to do short presentations to share their experiences and thoughts with you about how you can do voter registration drives. And of course, as always, we will close out our webinar today with a Q&A with our speakers. So make sure you're using that Q&A box on Zoom to ask us your questions. And you can use the chat for any comments, or if you're having some technical difficulties or having a hard time hearing speakers or anything like that. So starting with, what is cultural competency? So if you Google, you get many results. Thanks, Google. I picked out 2 that felt pretty accessible and like they get at what I think of as 2 really important elements of cultural competency. So the first one I think is very much about the self and us as individuals, and it's our ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from our own. So as individuals, we can work to be culturally competent I like this little graph on the slide because it shows that cultural competence isn't necessarily an end point. It's more about a cycle of reflecting and building skills. So our awareness, attitudes, knowledge, and skills, assessing those and building them. The second, I think, really gets at systems or organizations, like our nonprofit organizations. So it's a little more technical definition, but it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enables effective work in cross-cultural situations. So, there are ways that election administrators can make elections more accessible and culturally competent. And we've seen that with more and more languages being added to both ballots, but also things like sample voting guides. And of course, our nonprofits can really look at what are our behaviors, attitudes, and policies and approaches for making work with a diverse set of individuals really effective. So this is part of your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So why does this really matter when we are talking about voter registration, right? It's the same form, maybe except for language for basically everyone, right? Well, we just had the census results come out in the last month or two, and they've shown that the United States is increasingly less white, more multi-ethnic, and more multiracial. So you can see some pretty big changes on this graph where we're seeing especially more Hispanic or Latino individuals, more Asian, more people, and a lot more people identifying as being from two or more races. So we need to remember that we are not just talking about, if I'm speaking from my own experience, just, other white folks that look like me. There are lots of other people with racial and ethnic diversity that we want to reach as well. And if you pay attention to Nonprofit Vote, or you've seen in the news, there are still longstanding racial gaps in terms of who turns out to vote. We had really high turnout in 2020, which is great, but there were still a lot of people who didn't vote. And the gaps between different racial and ethnic groups, between people with and without college educations, and between the different age ranges, some of them got a little smaller overall, but some of them expanded. And the pattern overall of who turned out, even though it was higher, it still followed that same pattern. So those gaps still really exist. And in a changing country, those could even widen. So it's really important that we stay relevant, stay noticing, trends in populations, and that we're making sure our tactics and approaches are aligned with the people that we are serving and with the country we're in. So there are some benefits to using a culturally competent approach to reaching voters. So you can attract and engage new individuals that maybe would not have, you didn't catch their eye in the past, or they wouldn't feel comfortable or welcome approaching your voter registration drive, table, or event. But with a culturally competent approach, you're more likely to have those folks come in. You can build trust in your organization and improve your reputation as being, really welcoming to people of diverse cultures. You can learn new approaches and ways to relate to individuals different than yourself. So there's a good personal benefit in there as well for us as nonprofit staff, for our volunteers, and anyone that is being engaged in reaching those voters, as well as the voters themselves. It's also fun. A lot of culturally competent approach may integrate elements from people's cultures like food, music, dancing. This makes an event a lot more fun. And it's a way that you can reduce inequity and close voter participation gaps. On the other hand, if you choose to ignore this stuff and ignore cultural differences, you're taking some risks. You might alienate or miss out on some people in your community that need to be registered. You could be perceived as less relevant or out of touch. And you might even be perpetuating inequity by reaching out and mostly reaching people who look like you and are already better represented at the polls. Now, I recognize, we have a very diverse audience on the Nonprofit Vote webinars. For many of you, cultural competence might be more about cultural relevance. This is your communities, you're from a community that is maybe non-white, diaspora community, maybe have a strong cultural ties with a country outside of America and the people there. But I also know there's a lot of folks on this webinar and that follow Nonprofit Vote that look more like me, maybe share a little bit more of my life experiences. So we want to make sure that we're acknowledging our own experience and attitudes and looking at where we can learn from and embrace different cultural attitudes, ideas, and ways of being. So please, let us know in the chat, ask questions. We want this to be a real dialogue. I've talked a lot about racial and ethnic diversity, but there's more than just racial and ethnic diversity. Think about gender diversity, age, disability, sexual orientation. I used to work with a brilliant group of high school student organizers, and I had to really learn how to relate to those young people and how I could make myself somebody who they felt safe and comfortable around so that we could work together. And, they have a different way of relating than I do and different things that they really prioritize in their spaces. And so by learning from that, listening and embracing that, I was able to foster much better relationships. So you can use these principles of cultural competency to recognize differences and find strategies and solutions that affirm people's identity and meet their needs. So that is my little primer on or background on what it means to be culturally competent or what cultural competency means and why it really is important. But I'm now excited to introduce our speakers. So I will introduce our first speaker. Combine a love of storytelling, a passion for community engagement, the desire to explore old bookstores, and some internet cats, and Nadia Alamah will appear. Formerly a writing and English language tutor, Nadia has often spent her spare time engaged in the creation of various community art workshops and activities. As a second-generation Lebanese Muslim American, Nadia grew up surrounded by an international community of aunties and uncles who showed her that kindness and compassion are the ultimate values to strive for in life. She hopes to carry on that legacy through her actions and work. She currently serves as program coordinator for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, Michigan. And so Nadia, thank you, and I will pass the mic to you.
Caitlin, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for your time today. Thank you for attending and for being interested in this conversation to any extent and capacity. And then also thank you to Nonprofit Vote for having us here today, and also to National Voter Registration Day. At APIA Vote Michigan, this is something that is really also at the heart and core of what we do. And I'm happy to talk to you about that further and maybe throw in a few jokes here and there, but also just really focus on, talking about our perspective, sharing some of our experiences, but also from that, hopefully we can share some advice as it pertains to the conversation. So let's get into it. All right. So we have been around since 2007. We are an API Vote chapter based in Michigan. And well, you see some of the beginning of our timeline on the screen. We started out as an ad hoc group of individuals who banded together, for purposes of trying to get our API community to get out and vote. But also along that journey, I mean, we've focused on what we focused on trying to do phone banking, voter registration, trying to help people educate people as far as voting and the census, things like absentee ballots, you name it. We're doing our best, and we have been since 2007 and going on into today. Also recently, with the advent of COVID, we've been expanding into community resources and distribution. We've also been trying to we've been trying to do with COVID, the vaccination clinics, partnering with like Rite Aid and other community organizations. We've been trying to spread awareness and educate in a multilingual capacity. So we're not just like, one thing that we try to spend a lot of time on isn't just, and we can go to our next slide too, because I mean, this is, so we, of course, I'm going to backtrack for a second. We serve the API community in Michigan. We have most of our operations in southeastern Detroit, in Hamtramck, Warren, Sterling Heights, and so on. But everybody, across the state of Michigan. And we care a lot about, as I've started to kind of get into, community empowerment, uplifting our community's voice, trying to educate and empower in regards to civic engagement and getting out there and voting. And also, I mean, in a general sense, community care, because it's, how can we take care of our communities if we don't, reach out and do so together. And also, I need to mention that we do this in a nonpartisan capacity. We don't, do political affiliations. We just, encourage people, regardless of their political leanings, to take part in the care and the growth of our community. I mean, because even at a civic, or like at a city level, it's what we can do together to try to make the change we want to see. And unfortunately, we recognize that some of our community members can have a negative history with civic engagement. And being here, it's our job and our pleasure and our joy to try to make our civic engagement process, just to make it something that we can all connect to, and something where we can empower our community to see that, this is a space where you can, I mean, it's to say that it's safe, would be ignoring some of like the socio-political stuff that we deal with, but at the same time, it's something that we want to, if we don't do it, then it won't be safe for anybody. So this is something we can all do together. We'll go to the next slide. So I've also already mentioned this, I guess, but yeah, let's just talk about some things in more detail, and as they pertain to cultural competency. Like with like, I mean, this is stuff though that it's not just our phone banking, but it's really all of our projects that we try to focus on reaching all of our community. We try to do so in a way, I mean, because for example, with like multilingual, like translating materials, having people available who can speak in multiple languages, I think this is a very important thing. Well, we think it's a very important thing because you go around and see things in just English, and if you're not English proficient, that's going to be very uncomfortable for you, or it's kind of a lot to get through every day. And so, I mean, there is, for our first generation community, there can be, not always, but there can be a language barrier. And to, like, as part of making this, like as part of accommodating our community, or just trying to connect to our community, it's important to speak in the language that they're most comfortable in. Now, this isn't to say that everybody who's volunteering can, go pick up Duolingo and start, chatting with the owl and stuff. You can if you want to. It's good to learn another language anyway, but I think it's important to make sure that for organizations that you're also trying to have diverse recruitment, so that you're trying to have people from different cultures in your organization anyway, or working or partnering with other organizations who can help you with that, because we can all, build this as a team together. So that's, with our phone banking, we tried to have, our volunteers who could speak multiple languages, reach people who, or be available in the event that somebody would need to be transferred or connected to somebody who would speak a language they're more comfortable with. And yeah, I guess that's really about it for that, because we're all trying to, text and reach out to people and see if they are, and start that conversation. Let's get into that conversation. We'll go into the next slide. So also another thing we'd like to highlight is our voter registration drives, wherein we provide translated materials. But also you can see, like, with some of ours being more in person, we need to talk about that kind of dynamic as well. I mean, it's just kind of, it's important to pay attention. It's important to be fully present with somebody when you're having a conversation. It's not just, having a clipboard and going and talking to somebody. It's what experience you're trying to have with them. And I would have to say that with our voter registration drives, our volunteers did a great job of being attentive and building rapport in the process of trying to collect signups. But to be honest, I kind of just want to get into the heart of the advice that we have to share and just talk about that. Because I mean, we can go into logistics of putting on an event, but I think really at the heart of it, it's trying to adopt a mentality of building cultural competency into our lifestyles, and not just when we're, trying to get people to get out there and vote. So let's start to get into that. We can go into it. Thank you. So let's start with some basics. Listening is a universal thing. I mean, it's something that you can tell when somebody is listening. I think at the heart of it, it's important to show people when you're speaking with them, whether it's through a text conversation or whether it's through an in-person conversation, or depending on how you're communicating in a social media context, that you care, that you may not know entirely how to go about things, because we have different cues culturally. Things like body language might vary culturally as far as like what they might mean. The way that we phrase things can also be important. So it's important to be mindful of how we're phrasing what we're saying when we're speaking to people we're getting to know for the first time. I would have to say that it's important to you can try to practice with somebody if you're trying to like role play or pretend that you are having a conversation with somebody you absolutely do not know. You can go out into the world and have conversations with people you don't really know terribly well, but I wouldn't do that as far as like heavy topics, because you don't want to throw that at somebody. You want to start with something very light. But I would say that, think about, when somebody is approaching you. I mean, we've all been in that situation where somebody is walking up to you with a clipboard, or is at a table, and you just kind of feel like apprehensive already. I think no matter where you are, like where you're like, or what your culture or ethnicity is, like you feel a little bit of discomfort. So we have to acknowledge that hurdle to begin with. But that being said, we know to, try to show up with a smile, or show up, try to be approachable. I think it's important also to be aware of that, it's that the uncomfortable conversations are going to happen. I mean, or the awkward moments more specifically. Like, you can try to approach somebody and you can try to, smile and, have your standard, polite greeting, but it's still, you might, start a conversation about voting, and, and they might not be comfortable talking to you. And it's important to handle the discomfort with grace and just communicate as best as you can that you're here to offer help, you're here to offer support, you're here to show that you care about their well-being, but also that this is a very important thing that we're trying to do, and that one's voice can really go a long way when we all do it together. let's get more into that. Thank you. Let's say that you can, get somebody to start a conversation with you. Maybe you might want to ask them what their views are and just try to get to know them better. It's hard to just, cold call it because you don't really know who you're talking to. You don't know how they're reconciling with their identity at the time. You don't really know what other external conversations are happening around them. And if they're willing and receptive to have that conversation with you, it's important to try to to get some background into it if you can, because really, even if it takes time to have that conversation, we can really make a big impact with that together, kind of like the butterfly effect, where you can have a convo with somebody and then they're going to go and have one with somebody else, and it just kind of ripples. I really do think that every conversation we have like that matters, because it does get those conversations going with others, in some capacity. It's one of those thought-provoking kinds of things that we are doing, that we're dealing with. I mean, we don't really know if the person we're talking to might have some discomfort with politics because of like cultural experiences. I mean, I can say personally, as a Lebanese American woman, second generation, you go visit family or relatives, and like even then, you don't necessarily want to talk about politics. There can be some, distrust, in general about the political system and its viability, but it's important to still encourage people to try to get out there and have a say. And so, it might take getting into the nitty-gritty. It might take getting into the, just really dissect what's going on if they're comfortable with you. If not, then don't. If you don't want to, it's important to pay attention to how somebody is reacting. You don't want to just, throw that at somebody. You'd want to start, talking about something, more lighthearted, and then share, why you're here today. I mean, I can't tell you how many times like just meeting somebody in passing and just making a small joke about like the weather or something like that. Like, it sounds kind of basic, but those are things we kind of all have in common. Like, we're kind of living in the same area. We're kind of going, about our day to day. And it can just, if you ask a slight question like that, it can lead into something else, and you can get into why you're here today, and you can get into, I mean, that's not going to apply to texting. That's going to be more of like an in-person type thing. For texting, maybe, you might, I'll share also what not to do with texting. The other day I got a text from somebody in an activist campaign who was like, hey, is this Nadia? And I'm just like, who is this? I don't know if anybody else has had that interaction. But I mean, I guess for that, I would just say it really just depends if they're willing to talk to you or not. I guess more of what we'd have to share today relates to like in-person gatherings, and then just trying to get people to show up to begin with. I think Caitlin mentioned like in her preliminary PowerPoint, some really great things about partnering with other community organizations and trying to make fun events. I would definitely support that. I think that's a good way to go about it too. But also when you're in this kind of in-person interaction, which is more kind of what I was choosing to focus on today, just, it really is a bit of a dance when you're interacting with somebody. You want to show that you are, transparent, like you want to show that you care, you want to show this as quickly as possible. You can try to get into some, research about like different cultures, and let's get into that. But I'll say more in a second. I'm getting ahead of my slides and all that. So, all right. Yeah. So like, I think it's good to try to learn as much as you can, in a context of like, taking a course or trying to read different materials, especially for more complicated topics where somebody may not want to open up with you directly. It's good to try to seek input from people who are spending time talking about that kind of like we are. But also it seems like it would be effective to try to ask yourself, who's in your circle right now as a person, who who do you interact with on the daily? How much do you interact with your neighbors? How many of us, actually, I kind of want to use the chat for a second. How many of us talk to our neighbors? like anymore. Like I don't know if you want to like do exclamation marks if you do, or like a sad face if you don't, or something. Because I mean, that's the thing, like, because depending on where you're at, and yeah, it's just like our neighbors like live right next to us, and it's like it depends on like where you live. If you live in like residential area, maybe you might not see like as much moving, or if you live in more like a, or like a more a city, like densely populated like class of apartments or something, you might like interact more frequently in passing or something. It really just depends. um I feel like sometimes we can be kind of like fast paced if we're working like many jobs, and dealing with like the world as it is. That's a whole other thing. Also, thank everybody for sharing. Like I really appreciate that, and I love seeing your responses, and I love seeing that that some of us like are are doing this, and I'm very happy to see, because I can't tell you just personally how much I love talking to my neighbors just in passing. And I mean, like having moved recently, and everything, it's nice to do that. Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, it's what I'm trying to say about that is like, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, we like I think sometimes like if like it's good to do that, to try, like to talk to your neighbors, talk to people, like when you're like on your out like shopping, like in a store or someplace, going to events where you have interests, that things that you care about, to try to connect with people outside of your usual circles, or circles that you grew up in, because we don't really have control over that. We don't have control over like how we grow up, but once we're older, we can control to some extent, like trying to get out and meet new people, and get outside of that comfort. And I mentioned this because it's in those foundational years, and in the circle that we didn't have a lot of influence, a lot of say in, because we were younger and vulnerable. um like we have the chance to expand outside of that, and meet people outside of the people we know, and also outside of like the cultures that we're familiar with. It's hard to say to what extent, like I don't know how common it is that we have like a diverse community in our community. I think it really just depends on a lot of factors. But I guess I would also just kind of troubleshoot if you're struggling with cultural competency, like like to what extent am I, how much am I interacting with people outside of like my own culture, how much, like to what extent, like degrees of influence, like how much media am I consuming from like people of multiple cultures. It's getting into things like world films, and music, and like the cultural, like the product of what people experience and deal with. I mean, we start to see that universally we all have a lot in common. I mean, we all care about family. We all care about, I mean, we have things we want out of life. We're dealing with, living conditions that could be better. We're dealing with jobs where we could be paid better. Um, we deal with those around us who may not, fully understand us, or, kind of regard us with suspicion. Um, in different and to different extents. And I think the more of that we expose ourselves to as people in our everyday lives, the easier it makes interacting with people in the sense of trying to encourage, like, registration, and trying to get people to actually, get out and vote. And regardless of the way of doing that, and to encourage those around them to vote. It's not enough just to, it's not enough just to like have, like to say, like, like you, it's like also like tell your friends, tell your family, tell those you care about, because it's a community effort. Because if we all get together and vote for this particular person or that particular person, or just cast our opinion out there, maybe we could like elect somebody who could help us fix the flooding that keeps happening, that nobody's really doing anything about. It's things like that we're actually experiencing, in Hamtramck. I have to say too, if you're looking for, sorry, I guess I'm getting kind of starting to get to the end of what I have to share for now. Specifically how we, like what we can share as far as like specific tips for cultural competency, like, we can't speak to like every culture because like we're focused on like our API community in Michigan. We can say we interact with a lot of like we do interact with a lot of like the Muslim community and a lot of the like it's in our name, API community. We notice that some people prefer like same gender interactions. We notice that I mean it sorry, I don't even know where to begin. I'm just trying to think too, because it's kind of like it's things that like you like live, but it's hard to like explain to other people. You know, it's so like there's a bit of that. You kind of want to try to be as approachable as possible because some people can be kind of shy. I mean, I guess that's really all that I have to share for now. But if I think of anything, you know, more, I don't know, I'm spacing out right now, but I'll you know, throw more in chat, and you know, I'll do my best to also. I'm going to be creating as well a bit of a checklist for. Oh, I actually did almost forget. Yeah. So a note about ethnocentrism. What I would have to say when we're trying to do all of this, you know, reaching out into the into the world to be more culturally competent, you know, it's important to acknowledge that we have our own cultural biases from how we grew up, and that is the term. So I would just recommend, you know, reflecting on your own experiences through journaling, through conversations with your loved ones, to try to catalog what those things could consist of or be. And Karen, this, you know, specifically for you, you know, I have to say that when you spend time reflecting on that, that it can help you to, you know, it can help you to be more mindful of yourself, and you know, what you might consider kind may not be kind to somebody else. It may like doing that reflecting and having those conversations about what our predominant culture values can be very impactful in that you know, you might start to notice that there are things that affect your identity, there are things that affect how you interact with others, and that maybe there are other ways of reaching out that can have the kind of kindness we intend to express. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, please email me at my email listed on the screen. Also, please check out our website, apiavotemichigan.org. That's apiavotemi.org. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And I hope that there's something to take away from this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I really appreciate your time and perspective, and grounding us in the idea that cultural competence and that process really begins far beyond your voter registration drive or even just planning for it, and that it is a process that happens internally and within our organizations. And we can start by talking to our neighbors. Thanks for the folks that responded to your question in the chat. I love that people are chatting with their neighbors and maybe thinking about how they can be more open to them and welcoming moving forward. We have another speaker for you, so I am very excited to introduce our next speaker. So Ramdat Singh is a proud public school teacher and the director of civic engagement for the Caribbean Equality Project. He's been doing political organizing now for 15 years with an emphasis on engaging politically disenfranchised communities. He's based out of New York. Ramdat, welcome, and I will let you take the mic.
Thanks, Caitlin, for the amazing introduction. First of all, thank everyone for being here. Thank you all for engaging. And also thank you to Nonprofit Vote for having Caribbean Equality Project and myself as a panelist today. Can we move on to the next slide? So just a little bit about Caribbean Equality Project. We're a fairly new organization founded in 2015 in response to anti-LGBTQ hate here in Richmond Hill, Queens, New York. I'm not going to go into all the programs this Caribbean Equality Project has, but we do empower and advocate for our Black and brown, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming, and queer Caribbean immigrants here in New York City. We do storytelling, public education, community forums, civic engagement, and I will go into a lot more of our civic engagement work and how that relates to culturally competent voter registration. Next slide, please. So first things first, Caitlin mentioned, or she showed the census data. And one thing that, there's a discrepancy with the census data because there's no category or demographic question that asks about Caribbeans, right? So here we have Caribbeans that in the diaspora that classify themselves as Indo-Caribbean, and they may check off Asian. And then we have some Caribbeans who are Afro-Caribbean, and they may check out Black or other. So, here at the Caribbean Equality Project, or CEP, we had to come up with a way that is culturally competent to attract our diaspora communities. So one way was we thought about, besides the beaches and your coconuts in the Caribbean, what is one thing that people think about other than the white sand and blue water? So we thought about carnival. We thought about the feathers, we talked about the costumes, and also we recognize that the Caribbean has a large different diasporic nations within the Caribbean. So we came up with this thing called Mash Up the Vote, and that's very Caribbean centric, where anytime somebody saw our signs or posters and they saw Mash Up the Vote, they were like, oh, these people are Caribbean. I can go talk to them and feel comfortable with them. And as you can see in our main poster, we try to be inclusive of all of the identities that are reflected in the Caribbean diaspora, meaning we did have, our amazing carnival, costumes, but also we reflected on having Afro and Indo garments reflected as well. Like right here, there's a shalwar, and then this there's a man wearing some Muslim garb and a woman wearing a dashiki. And because we are a LGBTQ organization, we did incorporate the rainbow flag and the trans flag into our campaign. So that way our LGBTQ community can also feel comfortable to come to us. So our culturally civic engagement campaign encompassed us, meeting our community where they're at. And I'll talk about that a little bit next. Next slide, please. So our culturally competent voter registration and our campaign as a whole, called Mash Up the Vote, we, as I mentioned, met our community where they're at. So we did street canvassing. We're based in New York City, but we looked at where are most of our Caribbean folks located. It's Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. So we met our community members on the street corners, some of the busiest streets where they, frequent shops, restaurants, so on and so forth. That way we can stop them and educate our community members about the upcoming elections, how to register to vote, and how to vote. One thing that we recognize here at CEP is that in the Caribbean, our community members, there's a emphasis placed on the presidential elections or federal elections there in the home country. And we noticed that carried over here when they moved or migrated to the United States. Similarly, as a public school teacher, I do know that outside of people who are Caribbean, there is a lack of knowledge of civics and the 3 branches of government and 3 levels, right? There is a large emphasis placed on our presidential or federal elections, and not so much our local, whether it's our state or town governments or our state governments. So, we also had an added challenge to not only educate our community immigrants, community members about the election, but also to educate at the same time the different levels of government and what do all of these people do? What does the mayor do? What does the city council member do? What does the governor do? What does the president do? Right? So all of those things we have to tie into while using very Caribbean-centric language, that way people can understand. So some of the things that we've done, which, as I mentioned, street canvassing. During the pandemic, we set up our bi-monthly pop-up pantries. And that way we can educate our community members and get them as they are coming to pick up resources such as PPE and food. And we did phone banking, text banking, very Caribbean-centric, language. And also the last thing we did was we did one community rally, which is the picture pictured at the bottom, where everyone is holding up a sign. We did a community rally right before the primary election. That way we can educate people about New York City's new way of voting, which is ranked choice voting. So we did this to educate, and also I know Nadia mentioned about partnering with other organizations. We know that as nonprofits, some of our organizations don't have the resources. So that's why those local partnerships are very important. So as you see in the picture below, there are about 10 organizations that co-sponsored with us on this GLTV rally. Next slide, please. So some tips for cultural competent voter outreach. First things first, community partnerships, right? I live in New York City. I live in the Bronx. Every New York City is a very diverse place. So there are different organizations doing the work culturally competent to get their community members out. Like we have Dominicanos USA for the people from the Dominican Republic. We have the NAACP for Black African American voters. We have Puerto Rican Legal Defense Education Fund. We have Asian American Federation, different APA voice, API organizations as well. So it's important to partner up with all of these different organizations, especially if your populations are kind of like intermingled. And as I mentioned, meeting community members where they're at, on the street corner, in your local park. One thing that I've done as a teacher, sometimes after school or before school, I used to table right in front of my school building, meeting my students' parents right there, making sure they're registered to vote, have the information that they need in order to, participate and be more civically engaged in their own neighborhood. Use culturally relevant language, and blending culture with civic engagement. So one thing that we did, as Caitlin mentioned, some organizations use music. So what we did was when we had these rallies or we were on these street corners, we had our DJ. We had a DJ blasting some Caribbean music, the chutney, the soca, some reggae, so on and so forth. That way, it brought people to our table, because civic engagement and voter registration can be a little bit boring, right? So you want to engage people, you want to bring them in. And what else brings people more closer to you than music and food, right? At our table also, as you probably see in the picture below, we also had some Caribbean pastries, right? So blending culture with civic engagement, your communities, what they want, what they like. So blending those two things together and weaving them in is a good way to get people to buy in and come to visit your table. Remember, you're like salespeople. If you're not engaging at your table, nobody's gonna walk up to it, right? So that's why the music and the food and things that your community knows and likes, you can feature those and they will come up to your table, hands down. And once again, knowing your community. only you know your community. Like for me, we do more work in Caribbean-centric neighborhoods. Um, that's why we know our community, we know what foods, what music to play, how to, our infographics, our research, our pamphlets, what language to use. So that's why it's important to know your community. If you don't know your community, you cannot do competent or culturally competent voter outreach. That's just plain and simple, right? So one thing, if you don't know your community, I recommend walking around, stopping, at least having like a candid conversation with people to get to know them, get to know why they're disenfranchised, why are they not participating. And that's something that one conversation can go a long way and help you as an organization grow to be able to do more culturally competent voter outreach. I'm gonna stop there so we have time for questions. Can we just go to the next slide? So one thing, if you wanna get into contact with me, you can, my email is there. It's ramdat@caribbeanequalityproject.org. Or you can also follow us, Caribbean Equality Project, on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Our website is also caribbeanequalityproject.org. I'll drop that in the chat. So if you want to follow us and see some of the work that we've been doing, how are we doing civic engagement and voter registration and in weaving in our culture into the work that we're doing, follow us on all our social media platforms. Or you can also just, find me on Twitter or email me. All right. Thank you so much, and looking forward to all your questions.
Thank you so much, Ramdat. All right. So I hope it was helpful for everyone attending to hear a couple different perspectives on how you can create more culturally competent events. So I want to invite both my speakers up here so that we can dive into some of the questions. And folks watching, please add any additional questions you have into our Q&A box. The first question that I want to get into is someone was asking if there is a branch of APIA vote in Minnesota. So Nadia, do you know if there is, and if there isn't, how should folks outside of states where there are APIA vote chapters get involved?
Thank you so much. I will have to check the API vote website, the main, and we are happy to help if there isn't a chapter in your area. We are happy to help you get started and connect with API API vote to get that started. So yeah, I mean, and I can also connect you with our executive director, Rebecca Islam, and yes, so it's I will get on that ASAP.
Great. This is a good general question, and so I'd love to hear answers from both of you. Just any advice on getting to know a community that is new to someone? Like, what are the first steps? So I'd like to hear each of you. Why don't we start with Ramdat?
Kayla, can you repeat the question for me, please?
Yeah, any advice on how you get to know a community that you never really encountered before? What are some of those first steps?
So as I mentioned, I live in the Bronx. New York City is massive. There's 5 boroughs, right? One thing that I do personally is I literally hop on the train and I go around to these communities. Because I live in the Bronx, now I do work in Queens and Brooklyn. As I mentioned, having those candid conversations, right? One way to meet and get to know people is to have a conversation about your culture, things that you're lacking or things that you need in terms of voter registration, why you're not civically engaged. Sometimes people just don't know, right? And that's something I've encountered. people don't know that it's an election coming up. As much as we may broadcast it, we may have, you know, all these tweets and Instagram posts. Sometimes our community members are not on social media. And, you know, that's why those conversations, meeting your community members at where they're at is also important. And I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. Nadia, do you have any thoughts on this, first steps for, you know, learning about or engaging with the community?
I love everything Ramdat just shared. And I'm just like, yes, this is important. I absolutely 100%. And yes, I'm just so excited. Also, I do want to add too, because it really depends too on like, because it's super easy when you can go walking and you're it's more accessible by walking. There are places where you travel by car a lot. But then the question is like, where do you go by car to? So where my parents live, there is a mall. And like